Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The year was 2018 and I had just turned 28. As I sat in my apartment in downtown Des Moines, memories of my childhood flooded back, triggered by a news report about off-grid living. I couldn't help but recall the years I spent in that isolated barn, deep in the Iowa wilderness. My mother, Diane, had married James, an ex-Marine with a volatile temperament and an obsession with self-reliance. I was only 8 when James decided we needed to escape the system. He found an old farmer willing to part with the lumber from a dilapidated barn, and that became the foundation of our new home. The construction took months. I remember the sound of James's relentless hammering, the smell of fresh-cut wood, and the gradual transformation of a pile of planks into a structure that would become our sanctuary and our prison. The barn stood in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest. The nearest gravel road was a good mile away, accessible only by a narrow, overgrown path that wound through the trees. As a child, that path was my lifeline to the outside world, but it was also a source of constant dread. I can still vividly recall my first solo trek along that path. It was early autumn, and I was 10 years old. School had just started, and James had reluctantly agreed to let me attend the local public school, provided I made the journey on foot. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. As I stepped onto the path, the canopy of trees above seemed to close in, creating a tunnel of shadows. Every snapping twig under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Halfway down the path, I heard a rustling in the underbrush to my right. My heart began to race as I imagined all sorts of creatures lurking just out of sight. A deer, a wolf, or something more sinister. I quickened my pace, my backpack bouncing uncomfortably against my spine. The rustling grew louder, keeping pace with me. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my face as I tore down the path. Just as I thought my lungs would burst, I burst out onto the gravel road, gasping for air. I turned back to face the woods, half expecting to see some monstrous creature emerge. Instead, a rabbit hopped out onto the path, its nose twitching innocently. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by embarrassment. But that feeling of being watched, of being pursued through those woods, never truly left me. As I grew older, I became more accustomed to the solitude and the eerie quiet of our isolated home. But there were moments when the hair on the back of my neck would stand up for no apparent reason. Times when I could swear I heard whispers carried on the wind, only to turn and find nothing but empty air. James's paranoia seemed to seep into the very walls of our barn. He was constantly on edge, jumping at shadows and muttering about government conspiracies. His eyes would dart to the windows at the slightest sound, and he kept a loaded shotgun by the door at all times. One night when I was about 12, I woke to the sound of James pacing the floor below my loft bedroom. His footsteps were erratic, punctuated by the occasional curse or muffled shout. I crept to the edge of the loft and peered down. James was circling the main room, shotgun in hand, his eyes wild and unfocused. He kept glancing at the windows, then back to the door, as if expecting an invasion at any moment. My mother sat huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching him with a mixture of fear and resignation. I must have made a sound, because suddenly James's head snapped up, his gaze locking onto me. For a moment I saw no recognition in his eyes, only a feral, animal-like intensity that made my blood freeze in my veins. Then just as quickly lucidity returned and he lowered the gun. "Go back to sleep," he growled, his voice hoarse. "Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. That night marked a turning point, the beginning of a descent into a darkness that would haunt our lives for years to come. As the years passed, life in the barn became increasingly tense. James's behavior grew more erratic, his paranoia deepening like the shadows that crept across our clearing at dusk. I was 15 now, and the isolation that had once felt like an adventure now seemed suffocating. One particularly muggy summer night, I lay awake in my loft, unable to sleep due to the oppressive heat. The air was thick and still, carrying the drone of cicadas and the occasional hoot of an owl. Through the small window above my bed, I could see the full moon hanging low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the treetops. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a branch swaying in a non-existent breeze. But as I watched, the movement became more distinct, more purposeful. A dark shape seemed to detach itself from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, moving with an unnatural fluidity. My heart began to race as I strained to make out details in the moonlight. The figure was humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its movements too smooth to be human. As it glided towards the barn, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, words just on the edge of comprehension. I wanted to scream, to alert James and my mother, but fear had frozen my vocal cords. All I could do was watch in silent terror as the figure approached our home. Just as it reached the edge of the moonlit patch before our door, a cloud drifted across the moon, plunging the clearing into darkness. When the light returned seconds later, the figure was gone, leaving no trace of its passage. I lay there, rigid with fear, for what felt like hours. Every creak of the barn's timbers, every rustle of leaves outside sent a fresh wave of panic through me. When dawn finally broke, I was still wide awake, my eyes red-rimmed and burning. At breakfast, I tried to tell James and my mother what I'd seen, but James dismissed it with a snort. "Probably just a deer," he said, his eyes darting nervously to the windows. "Or your imagination playing tricks on you. You've been reading too many of those fantasy books." But I knew what I'd seen, and judging by the way my mother avoided my gaze, I suspected she might have seen something similar before. From that night on, I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. The woods that had once been my playground now felt like a prison, filled with unseen watchers. I began to understand why James kept that shotgun so close at hand. Weeks passed, and while I never saw the figure again, the feeling of being watched intensified. Sometimes, walking the path to the road, I would catch glimpses of movement just at the corner of my vision. When I turned to look, there would be nothing there, but the sensation of eyes upon me remained. One afternoon, as I was chopping wood near the edge of the clearing, I heard what sounded like my name being called from deep within the forest. The voice was faint, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. It wasn't my mother's voice or James's. It was something older, something that sent chills down my spine. I dropped the axe and ran back to the barn, my heart pounding. When I told James, his face went pale. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Stay close to the barn," he said, his voice tight. "Don't go into the woods alone anymore. And whatever you do, don't answer if you hear someone calling your name." That night, James boarded up all the windows on the ground floor. He muttered something about keeping them out, but wouldn't elaborate on who or what they were. The barn, once our refuge, now felt more like a fortress or a tomb. As I lay in my bed that night, listening to James's restless pacing below, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had awakened something in these woods. Something ancient and hungry. Something that had been waiting for us all along. The whispers in the dark grew louder, and sleep became an elusive luxury. The summer I turned 16 was marked by an incident that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It was a sweltering August evening, and the air hung heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. James had sent me to check our crude rainwater collection system at the edge of the clearing, wanting to ensure we'd capture as much of the impending rainfall as possible. As I made my way across the overgrown grass, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. The woods were unnaturally quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation of the coming tempest. I had just reached the collection barrels when a low, thrumming sound caught my attention. At first, I thought it might be distant thunder, but the noise was too constant, too mechanical. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating in my chest and setting my teeth on edge. Scanning the darkening sky, I saw nothing unusual at first. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as another product of my overactive imagination, I saw it. A dark shape, moving impossibly fast and low to the ground, skimmed the treetops at the far end of the clearing. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. No wings, no visible means of propulsion, just a sleek black form cutting through the air with eerie silence. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. The object was roughly oval-shaped, perhaps 20 feet long, with no discernible features or markings. Its surface seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the twilight sky. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A secret military aircraft? Some experimental drone? Or something not of this world? The object slowed as it approached my position, hovering for a moment about 100 yards away. I stood frozen, torn between the urge to run and an inexplicable compulsion to stay and witness whatever was about to happen. Suddenly, a beam of intensely bright light shot out from the underside of the craft, sweeping across the ground in a wide arc. As the light passed over me, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if every cell in my body was vibrating in resonance with some unseen force. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the light winked out. The object tilted slightly, then shot straight up into the sky at an impossible speed, vanishing into the gathering storm clouds with a faint sonic boom. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the empty sky. The first fat drops of rain hitting my face finally snapped me out of my trance. I ran back to the barn, my mind whirling with questions and theories. When I burst through the door, soaked and breathless, James and my mother looked up in alarm. I tried to explain what I'd seen, my words tumbling out in a frantic jumble. James's face darkened as I spoke, while my mother's eyes widened in a mixture of fear and recognition. "I told you they'd find us," James muttered, more to himself than to us. He grabbed his shotgun and headed for the door. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." "James, don't," my mother started to say, but he was already gone, striding purposefully into the rain-soaked night. We didn't see him again until dawn. When he returned, his clothes were muddy and torn, his eyes wild. He refused to speak about where he'd been or what he'd seen, but I noticed fresh scratches on his arms and a strange, acrid smell clinging to his skin. From that day forward, James's paranoia reached new heights. He began constructing elaborate traps around the perimeter of our clearing, spent hours poring over old maps and scribbling in a locked journal, and would often disappear into the woods for days at a time. As for me, I couldn't shake the memory of that strange craft. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that beam of light, felt that uncanny vibration in my bones. I began to have vivid, unsettling dreams, visions of vast, dark spaces and incomprehensible geometries, punctuated by flashes of that same brilliant light. Something had changed that night, both in our little world and in myself. The barrier between the reality I thought I knew and something far stranger had been irreparably breached. And deep down I knew that this was only the beginning. Years passed and I managed to escape the suffocating confines of our isolated life. At 25, I found myself living in Cedar Rapids, working a mundane office job and trying to piece together some semblance of a normal life. But the memories of those years in the woods never truly faded, always lurking at the edges of my consciousness. It was during this time that I met Liam. He was charming, adventurous, and refreshingly grounded, everything I needed to counterbalance the lingering shadows of my past. When he suggested a weekend camping trip to celebrate our 6-month anniversary, I hesitated at first. The idea of voluntarily returning to the woods, even for a short time, sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine. But Liam's enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself agreeing. Maybe I thought this would be a chance to face my fears, to prove to myself that the terrors of my youth were nothing more than the product of an isolated, overactive imagination. We chose a spot on the edge of a nature reserve, bordering some private land owned by one of Liam's friends. As we set up our tent in a small clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu, the towering trees, the whisper of wind through leaves, the earthy scent of the forest floor. It all brought back memories I'd tried so hard to bury. Liam, noticing my unease, went out of his way to make the evening pleasant. We roasted marshmallows over a small fire, shared stories, and gazed at the stars peeking through the canopy above. As the fire died down to embers, we retired to our tent, the sounds of the nocturnal forest our lullaby. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the noise jolted me awake. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was just Liam shifting in his sleeping bag. But as my senses sharpened, I realized the sound was coming from outside the tent, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. My heart began to race as memories of that night years ago came flooding back. The whispers, the shadowy figure, the inexplicable dread. I reached out and shook Liam awake, pressing my finger to my lips to keep him quiet. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, crunching on the leaf litter. They paused near the entrance of our tent, and I could hear deep, ragged breathing. Every muscle in my body tensed, ready to fight or flee. And then, breaking the tense silence, came a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A high-pitched, guttural screech that seemed to reverberate through the very air around us. It was primal, almost prehistoric in its intensity. Liam's eyes widened in shock, his face pale in the dim moonlight filtering through the tent fabric. I fumbled for the heavy-duty flashlight we'd brought, my fingers numb with fear. The screeching continued, punctuated by more of those heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there was moving again, circling faster now as if agitated by its own cry. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to shine the flashlight beam out into the darkness. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating trees and underbrush, but revealing no sign of our nocturnal visitor. Silence fell abruptly, as if the creature had been startled by the sudden light. For several long moments, we heard nothing but the hammering of our own hearts and the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Then, just as the tension began to ease, we heard it, a final mournful cry, fainter now, as if the thing was retreating into the depths of the forest. The sound faded, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. We sat huddled together in the tent, straining our ears for any sign of the creature's return. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we hastily packed up our campsite and headed back to civilization, our romantic getaway thoroughly ruined. On the drive back, Liam tried to rationalize what we'd heard. "It was probably just a deer," he said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Sometimes they make weird noises, especially during mating season." I wanted to believe him, to accept this logical explanation, but the sound we'd heard had been so alien, so utterly unlike anything I'd encountered in my years living in the woods. It had stirred something deep within me, awakening memories and fears I'd long tried to suppress. When we got back to Cedar Rapids, Liam, ever the problem solver, decided to research deer vocalizations. He found a video online and played it for me, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and triumph. "See? Listen to this," he said, turning up the volume on his laptop. The sound that emanated from the speakers made me freeze. It was eerily similar to what we'd heard in the forest, that same high-pitched, almost prehistoric screech. But something about it felt off, like a close approximation rather than an exact match. That's not quite it," I said hesitantly. "The one we heard was deeper, more guttural, and there was something else about it, something I can't quite put into words." Liam's brow furrowed. "But it's close, right? I mean, it has to be a deer. What else could it be?" I didn't have an answer for him. What else indeed? My mind flashed back to that strange flying object I'd seen years ago, to the whispers in the dark and the shadowy figures at the edge of our clearing. There were things in this world, or perhaps beyond it, that defied easy explanation. Over the next few weeks, I found myself obsessively researching cryptozoology and folklore, looking for any accounts that might match what we'd experienced. I came across stories of the Wendigo, the Jersey Devil, and countless other cryptids, but none quite fit the bill. Liam grew increasingly concerned about my fixation. "You need to let this go," he said one evening, gently closing my laptop. "It was just a weird night in the woods. We're safe now." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back from that forest. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside our apartment building. When I'd rush to the window, heart pounding, I'd see nothing but empty streets. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of something tall and thin, moving just at the edge of my peripheral vision, only to vanish when I turned to look directly at it. Was I losing my mind, or had our encounter in the woods awakened some dormant sense, making me aware of things that had always been there, lurking just beyond the veil of normal perception? My relationship with Liam began to strain under the weight of my growing paranoia. He couldn't understand why I insisted on sleeping with the lights on, why I jumped at every unexpected sound, why I refused to go on any more outdoor excursions. About a month after our ill-fated camping trip, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was shaky, filled with a mixture of grief and relief that sent a chill down my spine before she even delivered her news. "It's James," she said, her words barely above a whisper. He's gone. My stepfather, the man who had dragged us into the woods all those years ago, had vanished without a trace. The local authorities had conducted a cursory search, but given James's history of erratic behavior and his tendency to go off-grid, they weren't treating it as a high-priority case. There's something else, my mother continued, her voice dropping even lower. Before he disappeared, he left something for you, a journal. He made me promise to give it to you if anything ever happened to him. I felt a knot forming in the pit of my stomach. What's in it? I asked, dreading the answer. I don't know, she replied. It's sealed, but there's a note on the outside. It says, "The truth about what's in the woods." As I hung up the phone, I knew my life was about to change irrevocably once again. Whatever was written in that journal, whatever secrets James had uncovered during his paranoid ramblings and mysterious excursions into the forest, I had a feeling it would confirm my worst fears, and perhaps reveal horrors beyond even my darkest imaginings. I booked a flight back to Iowa for the following week, telling Liam I needed to help my mother sort out James's affairs. As I packed my bag, my hand lingered on the heavy-duty flashlight we'd used during our camping trip. After a moment's hesitation, I added it to my luggage. Something told me I'd need all the light I could get to face the darkness that awaited me back home. The small propeller plane touched down at the eastern Iowa airport on a gloomy Tuesday afternoon. As I disembarked, the familiar scent of cornfields and impending rain filled my nostrils, bringing with it a flood of memories both comforting and unsettling. My mother was waiting for me in the arrivals area, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. The years of isolation and fear had taken their toll, etching deep lines around her eyes and mouth. We embraced awkwardly, neither of us quite sure how to bridge the gulf that had grown between us. The drive to our old property was mostly silent, punctuated only by my mother's occasional comments about changes in the landscape, a new gas station here, an abandoned farm there. As we turned onto the familiar gravel road, I felt a tightening in my chest. The forest loomed ahead, dark and forbidding, seeming to swallow up the weak afternoon sunlight. I couldn't stay there after James left, my mother said softly as we pulled up to a small rundown cabin at the edge of the woods. This place belonged to old Mr. Henderson. He let me rent it cheap. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but clean. My mother had done her best to make it feel like a home, but there was an undeniable air of impermanence about the place, as if she were poised to flee at a moment's notice. We sat at a small kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee warming my hands. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, with a deep sigh, my mother reached into a drawer and pulled out a battered leather-bound journal. Here, she said, sliding it across the table. This is what he left for you. The journal was heavier than I expected, its pages swollen with what looked like newspaper clippings and hastily scrawled notes. A rubber band held it closed, and attached to this was a small envelope with my name on it. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the note inside. James's handwriting was erratic, the words pressed deeply into the paper as if he'd been writing in a frenzy. To my stepdaughter, if you're reading this, then they've finally gotten me. I know you think I'm crazy. Hell, maybe I am. But everything I've done, every paranoid action and seeming delusion, was to protect you and your mother from the truth. There are things in these woods, things that defy explanation. I've spent years tracking them, studying them, trying to understand their purpose. What I've discovered will shake the foundations of everything you believe about our world and our place in it. The answers are in this journal. But be warned, once you start down this path, there's no turning back. Knowledge is a double-edged sword, and some truths are better left buried. If you choose to open this journal, be prepared. Trust no one. And whatever you do, don't let them know you know. May God have mercy on us all. James. I looked up at my mother, who was watching me with a mixture of fear and resignation. Did you read this? I asked. She shook her head. I couldn't bring myself to, but I have a feeling. I think James may have been right about some things. There were nights when I saw. She trailed off, her gaze distant. Taking a deep breath, I slipped off the rubber band and opened the journal. The first page was dated nearly 15 years ago, shortly after we'd moved into the barn. First encountered today. Something in the woods watching us. Not human, not animal. Move too fluidly, too purposefully. Military, alien? Must investigate further. The entries that followed painted a picture of a man descending into obsession. James wrote about strange lights in the sky, unexplained sounds in the night, and shadowy figures that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He'd collected newspaper clippings about missing persons cases in the area, many of which had gone unsolved. As I delved deeper into the journal, the entries became more frantic, more detailed. James had started mapping out what he believed to be a pattern of activity, correlating sightings with phases of the moon and electromagnetic disturbances he'd recorded with homemade equipment. One passage, dated about 5 years ago, caught my eye. Made contact today. Or rather, they made contact with me. A voice in my head, but not like anything I've ever heard before. Words without sound, meaning without language. They know we know. Said they've been watching us, studying us. Said we're part of something bigger, some kind of experiment? Need to know more. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. The entries became more disjointed, filled with diagrams of impossible geometries and strings of numbers that seemed to be some kind of code. James wrote about underground facilities hidden deep in the woods, about portals to other dimensions, about a coming convergence that would change everything. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, chilled me to the bone. They're coming. I can feel it. The air is charged like before a thunderstorm, but 1,000,000 times more intense. I've hidden caches of supplies in the old tunnels. Food, weapons, my research. The key is in the place where we saw the lights that first night. Remember, you have to find it. You have to continue what I started. They won't stop with me. They're just getting started. I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day you'll understand why I did what I did. Be safe, be smart, and never stop looking for the truth. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ravings of a paranoid mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to James's words, something that resonated with my own experiences in these woods. I looked up at my mother, who had been silently watching me read. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to tell me everything you saw, everything you experienced, no matter how crazy it might sound." As my mother began to speak, her voice trembling with long-suppressed fears, I knew that my journey was just beginning. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had taken James and haunted our lives for so long, I was going to find the truth, even if that truth was more terrifying than anything I could imagine. The next morning dawned gray and misty, the forest around the cabin shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to muffle all sound. I stood at the window, clutching a mug of strong coffee, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. James's journal lay open on the table behind me, its pages filled with warnings and cryptic clues. My mother had talked long into the night, sharing stories of strange occurrences she'd witnessed over the years. Unexplained lights in the sky, shadowy figures lurking at the edge of our clearing, and nights when the very air seemed charged with an otherworldly energy. Her account filled in gaps in James's narrative, painting a picture of a reality far more complex and terrifying than I had ever imagined. As the sun struggled to break through the mist, I made a decision. I couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. I needed to find out what had happened to James, to understand the forces that had shaped my childhood and continued to cast a shadow over my life. "I'm going into the woods," I announced, turning to face my mother. She looked up from where she sat at the table, her face a mask of worry. "Are you sure that's wise?" she asked, her voice quavering slightly. "After everything James wrote, everything we've seen?" I nodded grimly. "That's exactly why I have to go. We need answers, Mom. We can't live in fear forever." She was silent for a long moment, then stood and walked to a small closet in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a battered backpack and a familiar object that made my heart skip a beat. James's old shotgun. "If you're determined to do this," she said, her voice stronger now, "then you should be prepared. The pack has some supplies, water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and the gun, well, I hope you won't need it, but better safe than sorry." I took the items, feeling the weight of the shotgun in my hands. It was a tangible reminder of the dangers I might face, of the thin line between paranoia and prudence in the world I was about to enter. After double-checking my gear and promising my mother I'd be back before dark, I set out along the overgrown path that led deeper into the forest. The fog clung to everything, droplets of moisture beating on leaves and spider webs. The damp air was thick with the scent of decaying vegetation and something else, something metallic and vaguely alien. I had studied James's crude maps carefully, trying to decipher his scribbled notes and cryptic symbols. He had marked several locations of interest, places where he'd had encounters or made discoveries. The nearest was about 2 miles in, near an old lightning-struck oak that James had used as a landmark. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified in the muffled silence of the fog-shrouded forest. More than once I caught a flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision, only to turn and find nothing there. About an hour into my hike, the fog began to thin, allowing shafts of watery sunlight to penetrate the canopy. I checked my compass, making sure I was still on course when a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was a low, pulsing hum, almost at the edge of hearing. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating in my bones and setting my teeth on edge. As I stood there trying to pinpoint the source, I noticed something strange about my surroundings. The trees and underbrush nearest to me looked normal enough, but further out, things began to get fuzzy. It was as if the very fabric of reality was blurring, the edges of leaves and branches becoming indistinct and wavering like a mirage. Heart-pounding, I fumbled for James's journal, flipping through the pages until I found what I was looking for. There, in his frantic handwriting, was a description of a similar phenomenon. Reality distortion field, strongest near the nodes. Approach with extreme caution. Prolonged exposure may lead to temporal spatial disorientation. I was close to something, one of James's nodes, whatever that meant. But did I dare venture further into this anomaly? As I stood there, weighing my options, a sound cut through the pulsing hum. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. It was coming from the heart of the distorted area, and though I strained my eyes, I could see no sign of its source. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run to the safety of the cabin and the normal world beyond. But I knew that if I left now, I might never find the courage to return. Whatever answers lay ahead, whatever dangers I might face, I had to press on. Taking a deep breath, I gripped the shotgun tightly and stepped forward into the shimmering unreality before me. The air seemed to thicken, resisting my passage like I was wading through invisible molasses. Colors began to shift and swirl at the edges of my vision, and I felt a strange lightness in my body, as if gravity itself was becoming negotiable. As I pushed deeper into the anomaly, the voice grew clearer. It was familiar somehow, tugging at the edges of my memory. Then, with a jolt of shock, I realized why. It was James's voice. My long-missing stepfather was calling to me from the heart of this impossible place. "Hurry," his voice urged, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "There isn't much time. You need to see, to understand." Fighting against the disorienting effects of the anomaly, I pressed on, following the sound of James's voice. With each step, the world around me became stranger, more alien. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, their bark rippling like water. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with an inner light, and the sky above, what little I could see of it through the canopy, had taken on a deep, unsettling purple hue. Just as I thought I couldn't take another step, that I would lose myself entirely in this maelstrom of warped reality, I burst into a small clearing. The air here was clearer, the distortion effects less pronounced. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood a sight that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a door, a simple wooden door standing alone in the middle of the clearing, attached to no visible structure. Its weathered surface was covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. James's voice emanated from beyond the door, clearer now. "You made it. Good. There's so much you need to know, so little time. Open the door. See the truth." With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob. As my fingers touched the cool metal, a jolt of energy surged through me. The world around me seemed to flicker, like a glitch in a computer simulation. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. What lay beyond that impossible door defied all logic and understanding. I found myself in a vast, cavernous space that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of the forest. The walls, if they could be called that, pulsed with an otherworldly light, displaying ever-shifting patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. In the center of this impossible room stood James, but not as I remembered him. He seemed both older and younger simultaneously, his form flickering and unstable. "You've come," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Now you'll learn the truth about our world, about the experiments, about the beings who watch us from the shadows between realities." What followed was a mind-bending explanation of a universe far more complex and terrifying than I had ever imagined. James spoke of interdimensional beings, of our world as a petri dish in a vast cosmic experiment, of the thinning barriers between realities. As he talked, the room around us shifted and changed, displaying visions of other worlds, other times, other possibilities. I saw great cities of impossible geometry, creatures that defied description, and glimpses of a future that chilled me to my core. "They're coming," James said, his form beginning to fade. "The convergence is near. You must prepare. The fate of our world, of all worlds, hangs in the balance." Before I could ask any of the 1,000 questions burning in my mind, the room began to dissolve around us. James's final words echoed in my ears as I felt myself being pulled back through the door, back through the distorted forest. "Remember, believe. The truth is out there, hiding in plain sight. Trust your instincts, and whatever you do, don't let them know you know." I came to my senses at the edge of the clearing where I had first entered the anomaly, the normal forest sounds rushing back like a wave. The door, the impossible room, James, all gone. But the knowledge, the terrible, wonderful knowledge, remained. As I made my way back to the cabin on shaky legs, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world I thought I knew was just the surface, a thin veneer over a reality far stranger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. And, somewhere out there, the clock was ticking towards a convergence that threatened everything. The days following my experience in the woods were a blur of frantic research and preparation. I pored over James's journal with new understanding, cross-referencing his notes with historical accounts, scientific papers, and obscure occult texts. My mother watched with a mixture of concern and resignation as I pinned maps to the walls, marking sites of strange occurrences and theoretical thin spots between dimensions. She didn't ask for details of what I'd seen beyond the door, and I wasn't sure I could have explained it if she had. As the pieces began to fall into place, a pattern emerged, a pattern that pointed to an impending event of cosmic significance. The convergence James had warned about wasn't just coming. It was already beginning. Strange reports began to filter in from around the world. Unexplained phenomena, mass disappearances, sightings of impossible creatures. The authorities dismissed most of it as mass hysteria or hoaxes, but I knew better. The veil between worlds was thinning and things were slipping through. I knew I couldn't face this alone. Using the skills I'd learned from James and my own research, I began to reach out to others who had glimpsed the truth. Fringe scientists, paranormal investigators, people who had encountered the unexplainable and lived to tell the tale. Slowly, cautiously, a network began to form. We shared information, resources, theories. Some thought we were crazy, that we were seeing patterns where none existed. But as the strange occurrences increased in frequency and intensity, more people began to listen. My relationship with Liam had ended. How could I explain to him what I'd seen, what I knew? But I found a new kind of companionship among this group of truth-seekers and reality questioners. We were bound together by a shared understanding of the world's hidden nature and the looming threat we faced. As I stand here now, looking out over the forest that once terrified me, I feel a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The path ahead is uncertain, fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. The convergence is coming, bringing with it challenges beyond anything humanity has ever faced. But we're not helpless. Armed with knowledge, united in purpose, we stand ready to face whatever emerges from the shadows between worlds. The truth is out there and we will find it, no matter the cost. Brine Bill. The crisp mountain air bit at my exposed skin as I led our group of 6 along the winding trail. It was July 15th, 2020, and we had decided to tackle Mount Malasimbo, one of the most challenging peaks in the Mindoro mountain range of the Philippines. I had climbed it twice before, but never at night. The darkness seemed to compress around us, held at bay only by the narrow beams of our headlamps. "How much further, Miguel?" Huffed Isabel from behind me. She was one of the newer members of our hiking club, and I could hear the strain in her voice. "We're about halfway to the first camp," I replied, trying to keep my tone encouraging. "Just another hour or so." In truth, I wasn't entirely sure. The night changed everything, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes. The trees loomed over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every rustle in the underbrush sent a shiver down my spine. We pressed on, the silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. As we rounded a bend, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just shadows dancing in the feeble light of our lamps. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Carlos, our most experienced climber after me, moved up beside me. I shook my head. "Nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks." But as we continued our ascent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed to press in closer, the air growing thick and oppressive. Every step became a struggle, as if the mountain itself was trying to push us back. An hour later, we finally reached the first campsite. It was a small clearing, barely large enough for our 3 tents. As we set up camp, I noticed Isabel's hands shaking as she fumbled with her tent poles. "You okay?" I asked, moving to help her. She nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear. I feel like something's wrong. Like we shouldn't be here." I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was just normal jitters for a first-time night climb. But the words stuck in my throat. Because deep down, I felt it too. A creeping dread that had nothing to do with the physical challenges of the climb. As we huddled around our small campfire, eating energy bars and sipping water, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow even the sound of our breathing. "We should get some rest," I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll start for the summit at first light." But as I lay in my tent that night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind sounded like footsteps circling our camp. And in the moments before dawn, I could have sworn I heard something. A low, guttural sound that was neither human nor animal. When I emerged from my tent, the others looked as haggard as I felt. Dark circles ringed their eyes, and their movements were slow, hesitant. No one spoke as we broke camp, each lost in their own thoughts or fears. As we set out for the summit, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far more dangerous than any of us had anticipated. The mountain loomed above us, shrouded in mist, its peak hidden from view. What secrets did it hold? What horrors awaited us in the heights? I pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the path ahead. But with each step, the dread in my gut grew stronger. We were committed now, too far along to turn back. Whatever lay ahead, we would have to face it together. The ascent to the summit was grueling. The trail grew steeper, the air thinner with each passing hour. By mid-morning, we had climbed above the tree line, emerging onto rocky slopes shrouded in a thick swirling mist. Visibility was poor, forcing us to stay close together. "Miguel," Carlos called out, his voice tight with concern. "Are you sure we're on the right path?" I paused, surveying our surroundings. The fog was so dense I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Doubt gnawed at me. The terrain looked familiar, yet off somehow, like a reflection in a warped mirror. "We should be," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "The summit's not far now." We pressed on, picking our way carefully over loose scree and jagged rocks. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our labored breathing and the occasional skitter of displaced stones. Then cutting through the fog came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But from the way the others tensed, I knew they had heard it too. Words just on the edge of comprehension, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Did you hear that? Isabel's voice was barely audible, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, scanning the mist-shrouded rocks around us. Everyone stay close. It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The air was still, the mist hanging motionless around us, and the whispers came again, louder this time. A chorus of unintelligible murmurs that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Carlos grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. Miguel, we need to get out of here now. I was about to agree when a scream pierced the air, high, terrified, and unmistakably human. It came from somewhere ahead of us, higher up the mountain. Someone's in trouble, I said, my heart racing. We have to help them. Are you insane? Hissed Elena, another of our group. We don't know what's up there. Sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares. I dreamed of the summit, of that twisted figure turning to reveal a face that was at once familiar and horrifically alien. I dreamed of my friends, their bodies contorting into impossible shapes as they were absorbed into the very rock of the mountain. And through it all, the whispers continued, promising release if only we would give in, if only we would join the others who had come before us, become one with the mountain that had claimed so many lives. When I jolted awake, heart pounding, I found Carlos sitting up, staring out into the darkness with wide, unblinking eyes. Do you hear them? He whispered. They're singing to us, Miguel. Such beautiful music. I grabbed him, shaking him roughly. Carlos, snap out of it! He blinked, focusing on me with difficulty. Miguel? What's happening to us? I had no answer for him. As the others stirred, I saw the same haunted look in their eyes. Whatever forces ruled this mountain, they were wearing us down, eroding our sanity bit by bit. And somewhere in the mist, drawing ever closer, I could hear the sound of slow, dragging footsteps. As the first light of dawn broke through the mist, we faced a grim reality. Our supplies were dangerously low, and exhaustion had taken its toll on all of us. Isabel remained nearly catatonic, responding only with vacant stares and occasional whimpers. The rest of us were little better, our nerves frayed to the breaking point by the constant assault of whispers and half-glimpsed horrors in the fog. We can't stay here, I said, forcing myself to take charge despite my own terror. We have to find a way down, or... I left the alternative unspoken. We all knew what awaited us if we remained on this god-forsaken mountain. We set out along the narrow ledge, moving with agonizing slowness. The fog seemed thicker than ever, limiting our vision to just a few feet ahead. More than once, loose stones skittered away under our feet, plummeting into the unseen depths below. It was Elena who spotted it first, a dark opening in the cliff face, barely visible through the swirling mist. A cave, she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Maybe it leads somewhere? I hesitated. The thought of entering that yawning darkness filled me with dread. But a rumble of thunder overhead made the decision for us. A storm was coming, and we needed shelter. Okay, I nodded. But we stay together. No one wanders off, understood? The others murmured agreement, though Carlos's eyes had taken on that distant, glazed look again. I made a mental note to keep a close watch on him as we entered the cave. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved into the darkness. Our headlamps cast weak, flickering beams that did little to dispel the oppressive gloom. The walls were slick with moisture, and strange, phosphorescent fungi clung to the rock in patches, giving off a sickly green glow. We had gone perhaps 100 yards when the first echo reached us. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the sound of our own breathing, but as we pressed deeper into the cave, it grew clearer, a rhythmic tapping like footsteps always just ahead of us. Hello? I called out, my voice cracking. Is someone there? The echo that came back was not my own voice. It was a garbled, distorted sound that bore only a passing resemblance to human speech, and it was answered by other voices, whispers and mumbles that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave. Isabel screamed, the sound shockingly loud in the confined space. She turned to run, but I caught her arm, holding her back. We can't go back, I said, trying to keep my own panic at bay. The storm. As if in response, a massive thunderclap shook the mountain, sending tremors through the cave. Small stones rained down from the ceiling, forcing us to press on deeper into the darkness. The passage began to slope downward, becoming steeper and more treacherous. We were forced to use our hands, scrambling over slippery rocks and through tight squeezes. All the while, the echoes grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just ahead of us. They surrounded us, a cacophony of inhuman voices that seemed to press in from all sides. "We need to go back," Elena shouted over the din. "This is madness." But there was no going back. As we rounded a bend, we saw that the passage behind us had collapsed, blocked by a pile of fallen rocks. The cave itself seemed to be changing, the walls pulsing with an unnatural, sickly light. "Oh God," Carlos whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Look!" I followed his gaze and felt my heart nearly stop. The phosphorescent fungi on the walls were moving, spreading like a living carpet across the rock. And as they grew, they formed shapes, crude, humanoid figures that reached out with tendrils of glowing moss. We pressed on, our progress now a frantic scramble through the twisting passageways. The echoes had become a roar, punctuated by what sounded horribly like screams of pain and ecstasy intermingled. After what felt like hours, we emerged into a vast chamber. Our headlamps couldn't penetrate the darkness fully, but what they revealed was enough to drive Isabel to her knees, retching in terror. The floor of the chamber was covered in bones, thousands upon thousands of them forming a carpet of bleached white that crunched sickeningly under our feet. And rising from this macabre sea were structures that defied description, twisted spires of fused bone and rock that reached towards the unseen ceiling. But it was what moved among these spires that truly chilled my blood. Shapes flitted in the darkness, too quick for our lights to catch fully. But in glimpses I saw limbs too long and joints bent at impossible angles. Faces that were mere suggestions of human features stretched across misshapen skulls. "We shouldn't be here," Elena moaned, pressing herself against the wall. "This is wrong, all wrong." I wanted to agree, to turn and flee, but something caught my eye. A flicker of normal warm light in the distance. "There," I pointed. "I think I see a way out." It was a desperate hope, but it was all we had. We set out across the chamber, trying to ignore the way the bones shifted under our feet, sometimes seeming to clutch at our ankles. The shapes in the darkness drew closer, curious or hungry, I couldn't tell. We were halfway across when Carlos suddenly stopped, cocking his head as if listening. "Carlos?" I reached out to him. "We have to keep moving." He turned to me slowly and I recoiled. His eyes were solid black, and when he spoke it was with a voice that wasn't his own. "Why run?" The thing wearing Carlos's face asked. "You're already home." With a cry of horror, I shoved him away. He fell backwards into the sea of bones, and as he sank, his body began to twist and elongate, merging with the structures around us. "Run!" I screamed to the others. "Don't look back, just run." We raced for the distant light, the sounds of pursuit growing behind us. Bones cracked and splintered under our feet, and more than once I felt something grab at me, trying to pull me down into the ossuary flood. Just as I felt my strength giving out, we reached the source of the light, a narrow fissure in the chamber wall through which daylight streamed. It was a tight fit, but terror gave us strength. One by one we squeezed through, emerging onto a steep, scree-covered slope. We didn't stop running until we were well away from the cave entrance. Only then did we collapse, gasping for breath and trying to process the horrors we had witnessed. Carlos was gone, claimed by whatever ungodly force ruled that mountain. And as I looked at the haggard, shell-shocked faces of my remaining companions, I knew we were not out of danger yet. The mountain had taken one of us. Would it be content to let the rest go? As if in answer, a cold wind blew down from the heights, carrying with it the faintest whisper of that unearthly chorus. The nightmare, it seemed, was far from over. Night was falling fast, and with it came a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into our very marrow. We had no choice but to make camp, though the thought of sleeping so close to that nightmarish cave filled us all with dread. As I dug through my pack for our meager remaining supplies, my hand closed around something I had almost forgotten: our emergency radio. It was a sturdy hand-crank model that didn't rely on batteries. In all the terror and confusion, I hadn't thought to try it before. "Hey," I called to the others, my voice hoarse. "I'm going to try to call for help." Elena and Isabel huddled close as I began to crank the radio. Static filled the air, punctuated by bursts of garbled noise. I cycled through the frequencies, hoping to catch some sign of civilization. Suddenly, a voice cut through the static, clear and strong. "Anyone there? This is Mountain Rescue. We've picked up your emergency beacon. Do you copy?" Relief washed over me like a physical force. Yes, we copy. This is Miguel Santos. We're stranded on Mount Malasimbo. We need immediate evacuation." The voice crackled back. "Roger that, Miguel. Can you give us your exact location?" I hesitated. In truth, I had no idea where we were. The mountains seemed to have warped and changed around us, defying all logic and geography. I'm not sure, I admitted. We're on the eastern slope, I think. There's a cave system nearby. There was a pause then. Understood. We're triangulating your position now. Sit tight and we'll have a chopper to you by morning. Do you have any injured? I glanced at my companions. Physically, we were battered and exhausted, but mostly intact. The psychological damage, however, was another matter entirely. One of our party is gone, I said, my voice breaking. The rest of us are okay, I think. Roger that. Hang in there, Miguel. Help is on the way. As the transmission ended, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We just had to make it through one more night. By morning, we'd be off this godforsaken mountain. But as I turned to share the good news with the others, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Elena was staring at the radio in my hands, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Miguel, she said slowly. Who were you talking to? I blinked, not understanding. The rescue team. Didn't you hear them? Elena shook her head. There was nothing but static. You were talking to yourself. I wanted to argue, to insist that I had heard the voice clearly. But a seed of doubt had been planted. Had it all been in my mind? Another trick of this cursed mountain? As if in response to my thoughts, the radio in my hand suddenly came to life again. But this time what emerged was not a reassuring voice, but a cacophony of screams and inhuman howls. The same voices we had heard in the cave, now pouring out of the small speaker with impossible volume. I dropped the radio, scrambling backwards. The screams continued, growing louder and more frenzied, and beneath them, I could hear words. Promises of power, of transcendence. If only we would give ourselves over to the mountain. Isabel, who had been nearly catatonic since the cave, suddenly stood up. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, a beatific smile spreading across her face. Don't you hear it? She whispered. It's beautiful. We have to go back. We have to join them. Before we could stop her, she turned and began to walk back towards the cave entrance. Elena lunged for her, but I held her back. Let her go, I said, my heart breaking. We can't save her now. We watched in helpless horror as Isabel disappeared into the darkness. The screams from the radio reached a fever pitch, then cut off abruptly, leaving us in utter silence. Elena turned to me, tears streaming down her face. What do we do now? I had no answer for her. The promise of rescue had been nothing but a cruel illusion. We were alone on this mountain with dwindling supplies and sanity. As we huddled together for warmth, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the unseen horrors that lurked in the darkness, but by the mountain itself. It was alive, I was certain of it now, alive and hungry. And as the long night wore on, I began to wonder if perhaps Isabel had made the right choice after all. Would it not be easier to give in, to let the mountain take us, to become one with whatever ancient, terrible force ruled this place? These thoughts swirled in my mind as exhaustion finally claimed me. And in my dreams I saw the summit, that barren plateau where it had all begun. Something was waiting for us there, something that would end this nightmare one way or another. When dawn broke, I knew what we had to do. We had to climb, not to escape, but to face whatever awaited us at the peak of Mount Malasimbo. It was the only way this would end. I turned to Elena, seeing the same realization in her eyes. Without a word, we gathered our remaining supplies and began the ascent. The mountain had called us, and we would answer. The climb was brutal. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, terror, and the mountain itself. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through nightmarish landscapes that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. Jagged rocks tore at our clothes and skin, drawing blood that the mountain seemed to drink eagerly. The air grew thin, making each breath a painful struggle. But still we climbed, driven by a compulsion we couldn't fully understand. Elena stumbled, nearly falling into a yawning crevasse that hadn't been there a moment before. I caught her arm, pulling her back from the brink. "Thanks," she gasped, her face pale and drawn. "Miguel, what are we doing? Why are we going up instead of trying to find a way down?" I shook my head, unable to articulate the certainty that drove me. "We have to. It's the only way this ends." She nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. We had come too far, seen too much. There could be no return to the world we had known before. Our only path lay upward, towards whatever waited for us at the summit. As we climbed higher, the whispers returned, no longer just in our minds, but carried on a wind that shouldn't exist. They spoke of power, of transformation, of becoming one with something vast and ancient. And despite my terror, I found myself listening, drawn in by promises of knowledge beyond human comprehension. The landscape grew more surreal with each passing hour. We crossed fields of stone that pulsed like living flesh beneath our feet. Clouds of mist took on shapes that hurt the eyes to look upon directly, and always, there was the sense of being watched, evaluated, judged by some vast intelligence that permeated the very rock of the mountain. We had been climbing for what felt like days when we finally broke through the cloud layer. The summit plateau stretched out before us, bathed in an unnatural, silvery light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And there, at the center of the plateau, stood the figure we had glimpsed on our first, ill-fated attempt at the summit. But now we saw it clearly, and the sight drove Elena to her knees, retching in terror. It was human. Once. But it had been twisted and changed by the mountain. Its limbs elongated and jointed in impossible ways. Its skin was a patchwork of flesh and stone, pulsing with the same phosphorescent light we had seen in the cave. And its face. Its face was a nightmare of too many eyes and a mouth that split its head in a Glasgow smile. "Welcome," it said, its voice a chorus of all the whispers that had haunted us. "You have come so far. Are you ready to become one with the mountain?" I wanted to run, to scream, to curl up and wait for death. But something held me in place, a mix of terror and awful fascination. What are you?" I managed to choke out. The thing's mouth widened in a grotesque parody of a smile. "I am the voice of the mountain, the keeper of its secrets. I was like you once, a climber who dared to challenge these heights. But the mountain showed me the truth, that humanity is but a fleeting dream, and true power lies in letting go of such limited existence." It gestured with a limb that was more tentacle than arm, and suddenly the air was filled with shimmering images. I saw the history of the mountain, the countless climbers who had come before us, each drawn by the siren call of the peak. I saw how they had been changed, absorbed, becoming part of something vaster and more terrible than I could comprehend. "Join us," the thing said, its voice now a seductive whisper. "Let go of your fragile humanity. Become one with the mountain and know power beyond your wildest dreams." I felt myself taking a step forward, drawn by the promise in those words. Part of me screamed to resist, but it was growing fainter by the second. Beside me, Elena let out a soft gasp. "Miguel, I can see everything. It's so beautiful." I turned to her and saw that her eyes had gone completely black. Her skin was beginning to ripple and change, taking on the texture of stone. "Elena, no." I reached for her, but my hand passed through her as if she were made of mist. Before my eyes, she dissolved, her essence absorbed into the very rock of the mountain. The thing that had once been human laughed, the sound reverberating through my bones. "She has made her choice. What about you, Miguel? Will you join us in transcendence or cling to your limited existence?" I stood frozen, torn between terror and temptation. The promise of power, of becoming something more than human, pulled at me, but with it came the certainty that I would lose myself, that whatever emerged on the other side would no longer be Miguel Santos. As I wavered on the brink of decision, a memory surfaced, the faces of my family waiting for me back in the world below. Would I ever see them again if I gave in to the mountain? That thought gave me the strength to take a step back. "No," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger. "I won't become that. I choose to remain human." The thing's face contorted in rage. "Then you will die here alone and afraid. The mountain does not let go of what it claims." The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the rock, glowing with that sickly phosphorescent light. I turned and ran. My only thought to get away from that monstrous entity and the choice it offered. Behind me, I could hear the enraged howls of the mountain itself, denied its prey. The plateau was collapsing, the very peak of Mount Malasimbo tearing itself apart in its fury. I ran blindly, uncaring of the direction, as long as it was away from the horror at the summit. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but still I pushed on. And then suddenly there was no more ground beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling through empty air as the mountain fell away beneath me. In that moment of freefall, a strange calm came over me. I had made my choice. I had rejected the terrible transformation offered by the mountain. Whatever happened next, I would face it as a human being. The world went black. I awoke to the sound of beeping machines and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. For a long moment I lay still, afraid to open my eyes. Was this real or another trick of the mountain? Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. The harsh fluorescent light made me wince, but it was blessedly normal. No sickly phosphorescence, no twisted shapes in the shadows. Just a standard hospital room with its beige walls and utilitarian furniture. A nurse noticed I was awake and hurried over. "Mr. Santos, how are you feeling?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. The nurse offered me some water, which I sipped gratefully. What happened?" I managed to croak out. The nurse's face softened with sympathy. "You were found at the base of Mount Malasimbo 3 days ago. You're lucky to be alive. The fall should have killed you." Fall. The word triggered a flood of memories. The nightmarish ascent, the horror at the summit, my desperate flight. I shuddered, closing my eyes against the onslaught of images. "The others," I whispered. "My friends." "Did they?" The nurse's silence was answer enough. I felt a wave of grief wash over me. Carlos, Isabel, Elena, all gone, claimed by the mountain and whatever ungodly force inhabited it. Over the next few days, as I slowly regained my strength, I learned more about my rescue. A group of local farmers had found me, battered and unconscious, in a field miles from where we had started our ill-fated climb. There was no sign of the others, and the search parties sent up the mountain had found no trace of them. The official story was that we had gotten lost, separated in bad weather, that my friends had likely fallen to their deaths in the treacherous terrain. It was a tragedy, they said, but not an uncommon one in these mountains. But I knew the truth. The mountain had taken them, transformed them into something no longer human. And somehow, by some miracle or curse, it had spat me back out. As I recovered physically, I struggled with the psychological aftermath of our ordeal. Nightmares plagued my sleep, filled with whispers and twisted figures reaching for me from the darkness. During the day, I found myself jumping at shadows, convinced that at any moment the hospital walls would melt away to reveal the pulsing, living rock of the mountain. The doctors diagnosed me with PTSD and acute stress disorder. They prescribed medications and therapy, assuring me that with time, the memories would fade, that I would be able to move on with my life. But how could I move on? How could I return to a normal existence after what I had experienced? The world I had known before felt like a thin veneer, a comforting lie hiding a deeper, more terrifying reality. And always, there was the pull. A whisper at the edge of my consciousness calling me back to the mountain. In quiet moments, I could almost convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a product of oxygen deprivation and fear. But then I would catch a glimpse of my reflection and see in my eyes a hint of that otherworldly phosphorescence. A reminder that part of me was still there, on that nightmarish peak. As the days turned to weeks, I knew I couldn't stay in the hospital forever. Eventually, I would have to face the world again. But would it be as Miguel Santos, the man who had survived an impossible ordeal, or as something else forever changed by my encounter with forces beyond human comprehension? The mountain had let me go for now. But as I stood at the window of my hospital room, looking out at the distant peaks shrouded in mist, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that someday, somehow, the mountain would call again. And when it did, would I have the strength to resist? 6 months after my release from the hospital, I found myself standing at the base of Mount Malasimbo once again. The mountain loomed before me, its peak shrouded in the ever-present mist. To anyone else, it might have looked like any other mountain in the range. But I knew better. I could feel its malevolent presence, a weight pressing down on my psyche. I hadn't planned to come back. After my release from the hospital, I had tried to rebuild my life. I got a new job, started therapy, even began dating again. But the nightmares never stopped. The whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched. They followed me everywhere. And then a week ago, the dreams changed. No longer was I running from the horrors of the mountain. Instead, I saw my lost friends, Carlos, Isabel, Elena. They called out to me, their voices filled with a mixture of pain and ecstasy. "Come back," they pleaded. "Finish what you started." I resisted as long as I could, but in the end the pull was too strong. So here I was, standing at the trailhead, a backpack full of supplies at my feet. I knew it was madness to return, but I also knew I would find no peace until I confronted whatever awaited me on the summit. As I began the ascent, I noticed changes in the mountain. The trail, once clear and well-maintained, was now overgrown and treacherous. Strange fungi grew in patches, their caps glowing with that familiar, sickly light. The air grew thick with an odd metallic scent that made my head swim. Hours into the climb, I heard it, the whispers. But this time they weren't just in my head. They emanated from the rocks themselves, a susurration of inhuman voices that grew louder with each step I took. "Welcome back," they seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you." I pressed on, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The landscape grew more surreal as I climbed higher. Rocks pulsed like living flesh beneath my feet. The mist took on shapes that defied description, reaching out with tendrils that dissipated when I looked at them directly. As I neared the summit, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, one I recognized with a jolt of horror. It was my own voice, but distorted, layered with something ancient and inhuman. "You've come home," it said. "Are you ready to claim your destiny?" I emerged onto the summit plateau, and there it was, the twisted figure I had fled from months ago. But now I saw it clearly for what it was, not some external monster, but a mirror, a reflection of what I could become. It smiled at me, a grotesque stretching of too many mouths across a face that was both familiar and alien. "You see now, don't you? You've always been part of us, part of the mountain." Your friends understood. They embraced the change. "Why do you still resist?" As it spoke, the air around me shimmered. I saw visions of power unimaginable, of consciousness expanded beyond the limits of human perception. I saw the ability to shape reality itself, to transcend the boundaries of flesh and become something more. For a moment, I wavered. The temptation was immense, the promise of that power almost overwhelming. I took a step forward, feeling the mountain's eager response. The rock beneath my feet softened, ready to absorb me, to remake me in its image. But then unbidden memories surfaced, not of the horrors I had witnessed, but of simple human moments, the warmth of my mother's embrace, the laughter shared with friends over a meal, the quiet joy of watching a sunrise, all the small, precious experiences that made up a human life. I realized then what the mountain offered was not transcendence, but obliteration. To accept its power would mean losing everything that made me who I was. I took a step back. "No," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "I choose to remain human, with all its limitations, all its pain and joy. That's where true meaning lies." The thing that wore my face snarled, its form twisting in rage. "You fool. You cannot deny your true nature. The mountain is part of you now. You will never escape its call." The ground began to shake, cracks appearing in the rock glowing with eldritch light. The air filled with screams of rage, of pain, of loss. I turned and ran just as I had months before, fleeing from the collapsing summit. But this time was different. With each step I felt a weight lifting. The whispers faded, the oppressive presence of the mountain receding. I ran not in blind panic, but with purpose, each footfall an affirmation of my choice. When I finally reached the base of the mountain, I collapsed, gasping for breath. Above me, the peak of Mount Malasimbo was hidden in roiling storm clouds, flashes of unnatural lightning illuminating their depths. I knew then that it was over. The mountain had released its hold on me. Oh, there might always be a small part of me that remembered, that felt the echo of its call, but I had faced the choice and made my decision. I had chosen humanity, with all its flaws and beauties. As I began the long walk back to civilization, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The nightmare was over, I had descended into madness and emerged, battered but unbroken, on the other side. The mountain would always be there, I knew. It would call to others, offer them the same terrible choice. But that was a battle for another day. For now I was content to be simply, wonderfully human. To feel the sun on my face, the solid earth beneath my feet, and know that I was alive. I had climbed the mountain of madness, and in the end I had chosen to come down. And in that descent I had found something far more precious than the power the mountain offered. I had found myself. As I walked away, I didn't look back. But I smiled, knowing that whatever challenges the future held, I would face them as Miguel Santos, scarred, changed, but undeniably, unequivocally human. The dense Queensland forest has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I, Father Tom, grew up as the son of a forest ranger, his childhood playground stretching across acres of untamed wilderness. As I grew older, he made it his mission to share his love for the great outdoors with me, his only child. Every school holiday and long weekend, we'd pack up our old Land Cruiser and head out into the heart of the forest, leaving behind the comforts of our suburban home for the rugged embrace of nature. I was born James Hawthorne, but everyone calls me Jamie. At 17, I'm lanky and awkward, with a mop of unruly brown hair that refuses to be tamed. My pale skin, which burns easily under the harsh Australian sun, is a stark contrast to my father's weathered, tanned complexion. Despite our physical differences, we share an unbreakable bond forged through countless adventures in the wilderness. Our forest expeditions were more than just father-son bonding time. They were an education. Dad taught me how to track animals, start a fire with nothing but sticks and determination, and navigate using only the stars and the moss on tree trunks. But more than anything, he taught me respect for the land and its secrets. "The forest has a memory, Jamie," he'd often say, his eyes scanning the canopy above us. "It remembers everything that's happened within its borders, both good and bad. You've got to listen to it, son. It'll tell you when something's not right." At the time, I thought it was just another one of Dad's nuggets of forest wisdom, like how to tell which berries were safe to eat, or how to avoid disturbing a snake's nest. I didn't realize then how prophetic those words would become. One place Dad loved to take us was a dilapidated farm hidden deep within the forest. It was impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look, invisible from the main logging roads and hiking trails. The locals knew it as Spike's hut, named after its former owner, a man whose reputation still echoed through the trees long after his departure. I remember the first time Dad took me there. I was about 10 years old, full of energy and curiosity. We'd been driving for hours along bumpy dirt tracks that barely qualified as roads. The Land Cruiser's suspension groaned in protest with every pothole and exposed route we encountered. "Where are we going, Dad?" I'd asked for what felt like the 100th time, my patience wearing thin. Dad's eyes twinkled with a mix of excitement and something else I couldn't quite place. "We're going to a special place, Jamie. A place with history. But you've got to promise me something, okay?" I nodded eagerly, always ready for a new adventure. "When we get there, you stay close to me. No wandering off no matter what you see or hear, got it?" The seriousness in his voice sent a shiver down my spine, but I agreed nonetheless. Little did I know that this visit would be the first of many, each one peeling back layers of a dark history that perhaps should have remained buried. As we rounded a final bend, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a ramshackle structure that looked like it had been pieced together from the scraps of a dozen different buildings. The tin roof was rusted and sagging, held up by walls that seemed to lean at impossible angles. Around the hut, the remnants of what must have once been a productive farm lay scattered: broken fences, rusted machinery, and overgrown fields reclaimed by the relentless Australian bush. "Welcome to Spike's hut," Dad announced, killing the engine. I pressed my face against the window, taking in every detail. Despite the warm spring day, I felt a chill creep over me. Something about this place felt wrong. It was as if the very air around the hut was heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. "Who's Spike?" I asked as we climbed out of the car. Dad's face darkened. Spike Buchanan was a local farmer who lived here for decades, right up until the mid-90s. He wasn't what you'd call a friendly neighbor. As we approached the hut, Dad began to tell me about Spike. The stories painted a picture of a man who seemed to have stepped out of a horror novel. Abrasive, violent, and utterly indifferent to the suffering of others. Spike had a reputation for approaching men in the local bar who wore earrings and tearing them out without warning or remorse. There were whispers of people who had crossed him disappearing without a trace, their fates known only to the silent trees surrounding Spike's property. "Why would anyone want to live out here all alone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as we stood in the shadow of the decaying hut. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Some people, Jamie, they can't live with others. Or maybe others can't live with them." As we explored the property that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. Dad seemed on edge too, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings as he pointed out the remnants of Spike's life. "See those marks on the doorframe?" he said, pointing to a series of deep gouges in the wood. "Spike used to notch it every time he—" Dad's voice trailed off and he shook his head. "Never mind. Some stories are best left untold." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Dad ushered me back to the car. As we drove away, I turned to look back at Spike's hut. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the broken windows watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, as we camped in a more hospitable part of the forest, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, unable to shake the image of that decrepit hut from my mind. The stories Dad had told me swirled in my imagination, populating the darkness with sinister shapes and unseen threats. "Dad," I whispered, knowing he was still awake. "Why did you take me there?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Because sometimes, Jamie, the most important lessons are the ones that scare us a little. The forest isn't always a friendly place, neither are the people in it. You need to learn to trust your instincts to recognize when something's not right." I nodded in the darkness, not fully understanding but sensing the weight of his words. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself that I would never return to Spike's hut. As the years passed, our visits to Spike's hut became a regular part of our forest excursions. Each time we returned, the structure seemed more dilapidated, as if the very earth beneath it was trying to reclaim the land Spike had stolen. The roof sagged a little more, the walls leaned at even more precarious angles, and the undergrowth crept ever closer, threatening to swallow the hut whole. But while the physical appearance of the place deteriorated, the atmosphere remained unchanged. That palpable sense of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking our every move, never wavered. If anything, it intensified with each visit, as if whatever presence lingered there was growing bolder, more curious about the interlopers who dared to trespass on its domain. I was 14 when I first noticed the signs that we weren't the only ones visiting Spike's hut. It was a crisp autumn day, the air filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. As Dad and I approached the clearing, I spotted something that hadn't been there on our last visit. A cluster of 44-gallon drums arranged in a rough circle near the hut. "Dad," I said, pointing. "Look at that." He followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight. I watched as he approached the drums cautiously, his body tense, ready to react to any sudden movement. When he reached them, he peered inside one, then quickly recoiled, his face a mask of disgust. "What is it?" I called out, my curiosity overriding my apprehension. Dad walked back to me, his expression grim. "They're full of smashed beer bottles," he said. "Hundreds of them. Someone's been having parties out here." The idea of anyone willingly spending time at Spike's hut, let alone having a party there, sent a chill down my spine. Who would choose this place, with its oppressive atmosphere and dark history, as a spot for celebration? As we continued our exploration that day, we found more evidence of recent human activity. There was a fire pit near the hut, the ashes still warm to the touch. Scraps of food packaging littered the ground, and here and there we spotted fresh tire tracks in the muddy soil. "Maybe it's just some local kids," I suggested, trying to rationalize the signs of life in a place that had always felt more dead than alive. You know, looking for a spooky place to hang out. Dad shook his head, his eyes never stopping their constant scan of our surroundings. "Maybe. he said, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe it. But whoever they are, they're taking a big risk. This place isn't safe. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what specific danger he feared, but something in his demeanor stopped me. There were times when Dad seemed to know more about Spike's hut than he let on, as if he was privy to secrets he wasn't ready to share. As we left that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. The beer bottles, the fire pit, they were like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. And underlying it all was a growing sense of dread, a certainty that something was building, gathering strength in the shadows of Spike's hut. That night, I had my first nightmare about the place. In my dream, I was alone at the hut, the forest around me eerily silent. As I approached the building, I could hear whispers coming from inside, a cacophony of voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I knew I should run, that I was in terrible danger, but my feet carried me forward against my will. As I reached for the door, it swung open on its own, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow all light. And from that darkness, a hand reached out, gnarled, scarred, with dirt-encrusted fingernails. It grabbed my wrist, its grip like iron, and began to pull me in. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Dad rushed into my room, concern etched on his face. "Jamie, what's wrong?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my bed. I told him about the dream, watching as his expression grew more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring at the wall as if he could see through it to some distant point. "It was just a dream," he said finally, but there was a hollowness to his words, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Spike's hut, the stories. They're getting to you. Maybe we should take a break from going there for a while." I nodded, grateful for the suggestion, but even as Dad left the room assuring me that everything was fine, I couldn't shake the lingering terror of the dream. It had felt so real, so vivid. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that it wasn't just a nightmare, it was a warning. The next few months passed without any trips to Spike's hut. We still went camping in the forest, but Dad steered clear of that particular area, finding new spots for us to explore. Yet even as we hiked new trails and discovered hidden waterfalls, my thoughts kept drifting back to that decaying structure in the heart of the woods. I found myself researching the history of the area, poring over old newspapers and local history books in the town library. Most of what I found aligned with the stories Dad had told me. Spike Buchanan had been a real person, a farmer who had lived on that isolated property for decades before disappearing in the mid-1990s. But there were other stories too, whispers and rumors that painted an even darker picture. There were reports of hikers going missing in the area around Spike's property, their bodies never found. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange lights seen in the forest at night, and eerie sounds that couldn't be explained by any known animal. One afternoon, as I was leaving the library with a stack of photocopied newspaper articles, I quite literally ran into old Pete, a local who had lived in the area his entire life. As I helped him pick up his dropped books, apologizing profusely, he squinted at the papers I was carrying. "Researching Spike's place, are you?" he asked, his roomy eyes suddenly sharp. I nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" Old Pete chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Not many other reasons for a young fella like yourself to be digging through moldy old papers. Let me give you some advice, son. Leave it alone. Some stories are better left untold. Some places better left unexplored." His words echoed those my father had spoken years ago, sending a shiver down my spine. "Did you know Spike?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Old Pete's face darkened. "Knew him?" I knew him. Everyone around here did. Man was a devil in human skin, if you ask me. The things he did... He trailed off, shaking his head. "What things?" I pressed, sensing I was on the verge of uncovering something important. But old Pete just patted me on the shoulder, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. "Go home, boy. Forget about Spike and his cursed land. Nothing good ever came from stirring up old ghosts." As he shuffled away, leaving me standing there with my pile of papers, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Old Pete's warning, far from discouraging me, only fueled my determination to uncover the truth about Spike's hut. The summer I turned 17 marked a turning point in my relationship with Spike's hut and the mysteries that surrounded it. By then, my fascination with the place had grown into something bordering on obsession. I had filled notebooks with information gleaned from old newspapers, local gossip, and my own observations during our infrequent visits. Dad had become increasingly reluctant to take me there, always finding excuses to explore other parts of the forest, but I could sense his unease whenever I brought up the subject. It was a sweltering day in late January when everything changed. I had convinced a group of my friends, Will, Zach, and Katie, to join Dad and me on a camping trip. They were all city kids, more comfortable with video games than sleeping bags, but the promise of adventure and my endless tales about Spike's hut had finally worn down their resistance. As we piled into Dad's Land Cruiser, the excitement was palpable. Will and Zach were arguing good-naturedly about who would be the first to spot a deadly snake or spider, while Katie rolled her eyes and tried to get a signal on her phone. Dad looked tense, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as we pulled out of our driveway. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying that tone of forced casualness I had come to recognize. "We're just going for a nice, relaxing camping trip. No ghost hunting or anything crazy, all right?" We all nodded, but I caught Will's eye in the rearview mirror and saw the glint of mischief there. We had already made plans to sneak off and explore Spike's hut on our own, regardless of Dad's warnings. The drive seemed to take longer than usual, the forest roads rougher and more overgrown than I remembered. By the time we turned onto the barely visible track that led to Spike's property, even Zach had fallen silent, sensing the change in atmosphere. As we emerged into the clearing where the hut stood, I felt the familiar weight of dread settle over me. But this time something was different. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Dad pulled the Land Cruiser to a stop, the engine's rumble fading to leave us in an eerie silence. For a moment, no one moved, all of us taking in the dilapidated structure before us. "Is that it?" Katie whispered, her earlier bravado gone. "It looks wrong." I knew exactly what she meant. Spike's hut had always given off an unsettling vibe, but today it seemed to radiate malevolence. The shadows around it seemed deeper, the angles of its sagging roof more grotesque. Dad cleared his throat. "All right, everyone out. But stay close to the car. I want to show you something, then we'll head to our campsite." As we climbed out, stretching our legs after the long drive, I scanned our surroundings out of habit. That's when I saw it, a figure on the hill opposite the hut. At first glance, it looked like a cowboy slumped against a lone tree, hat pulled low over his face as if taking a nap. But something about the posture was off. No one would choose to sleep in such an uncomfortable position, spine curved at an unnatural angle, limbs splayed awkwardly. "Dad," I called out, my voice tight with sudden fear. "Look, on the hill." Everyone turned to follow my gaze. Dad's reaction was immediate and alarming. His face drained of color, and in one fluid motion, he was herding us back into the car. "Change of plans," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "We're going to check out a different spot." "But we just got here," Zach protested. "What about now?" Dad snapped, already turning the key in the ignition. As we pulled away, I craned my neck to keep the figure in sight. It hadn't moved an inch, despite the noise of our arrival and hasty departure. Just before we rounded a bend in the road, I could have sworn I saw its head turn, following our retreat. "Dad, what was that?" I asked once we were well away from Spike's hut. "Who was that man?" "What man?" Will piped up from the back seat. "I didn't see anyone." I turned to look at him, confusion etched on my face. "The cowboy on the hill. You must have seen him." But Will, Zach, and Katie all shook their heads, looking at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "There was no one there, Jamie," Katie said gently. "Just trees and shadows." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again. How could they not have seen the figure? It had been right there, plain as day. I turned to my father, seeking confirmation, but he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tight. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Dad found us a campsite by a picturesque stream far from Spike's hut. We set up tents, built a fire, and roasted marshmallows, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath it all. My friends kept shooting me worried glances, and Dad remained uncharacteristically quiet. That night, as the others slept, I lay awake in my tent, replaying the scene at Spike's hut over and over in my mind. I was certain of what I'd seen. A figure, unnaturally still, watching us from the hill. But if the others hadn't seen it, what did that mean? Was I losing my mind, seeing things that weren't there? Or was there something more sinister at play? I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew I was jerking awake, heart pounding. Something had woken me, a sound just on the edge of hearing. I lay still, straining my ears. There it was again, a whisper carried on the night breeze. Words I couldn't quite make out, but which filled me with an inexplicable dread. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite was bathed in silvery moonlight, shadows dancing as clouds scudded across the sky. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary, then movement caught my eye. At the edge of our campsite, just where the firelight faded into darkness, stood a figure. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the silhouette. The same cowboy from the hill, still in that unnatural slumped posture. As I watched, frozen in terror, its head began to turn towards me with agonizing slowness. I scrambled backward, zipping the tent closed and burying myself in my sleeping bag. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but fear had robbed me of my voice. I lay there, shaking, ears straining for any sound of approach. Minutes stretched into hours, each rustle of leaves outside sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck, exhausted and on edge. As we packed up camp that morning, I debated whether to tell the others what I'd seen. But the memory of their disbelief the day before held me back. Instead, I watched Dad, wondering if he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't until we were nearly home, the forest giving way to familiar suburban streets, that Dad finally broke his silence. "Jamie," he said, his voice low so the others in the back seat wouldn't hear, "what you saw yesterday, I need you to forget about it. For your own good." I stared at him, a mix of emotions churning in my gut. "You saw it too, didn't you?" The cowboy. "Why didn't you say anything?" Dad's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Some things are better left alone, son." Spike's hut, the cowboy. "They're part of a history that should stay buried." "But, no." He cut me off, his tone final.
"Promise me you'll let this go."
"No more visits to the hut, no more research. It's not safe." I wanted to argue, to demand answers to the questions that had been building for years. But something in Dad's expression stopped me. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Okay," I said finally. "I promise." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was a promise I couldn't keep. The mystery of Spike's hut and the cowboy on the hill had sunk its hooks into me too deeply. I needed answers, no matter the cost. As we dropped my friends off at their homes, each of them giving me worried looks as they left, I began to formulate a plan. Dad might refuse to help, but I wasn't alone in my curiosity. There were others who had grown up with the legends of Spike's hut, others who might be willing to help me uncover the truth. The weeks following our aborted camping trip passed in a blur of mundane routine, but beneath the surface my mind was racing. Despite my promise to Dad, I couldn't shake the image of the cowboy on the hill, nor the unsettling encounter at our campsite. Each night I found myself jolting awake, convinced I could hear whispers on the edge of hearing, only to be met with the ordinary sounds of our quiet suburban street. At school, I went through the motions, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Spike's hut and its mysteries. My friends noticed the change in me. Will and Zach tried to draw me out with jokes and invitations to hang out, while Katie watched me with concern, often catching my eye with a questioning look I couldn't bring myself to answer. It was Katie who finally cornered me one afternoon as I was leaving the school library, my arms laden with books on local history and folklore. "All right, Jamie," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Spill, what's going on with you?" I hesitated, weighing my options. Katie had always been the most level-headed of our group, quick to debunk ghost stories and urban legends. But she was also fiercely loyal and had a knack for research that could prove invaluable. Making a split-second decision, I nodded towards an empty classroom. "Not here. Come on." Once inside, I dumped my books on a desk and turned to face her. "You remember the camping trip? Spike's hut?" Katie's brow furrowed. "You mean that creepy old shack your dad wouldn't let us explore?" "Yeah, what about it?" Taking a deep breath, I launched into the story. Not just of what I'd seen on the hill and at our campsite, but everything I knew about Spike's hut. The history, The rumors, the unexplained disappearances. As I spoke, I saw the skepticism in Katie's eyes gradually give way to curiosity, and then to something approaching belief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, absently twirling a strand of her dark hair around her finger. A habit I knew meant she was deep in thought. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's say I believe you. What do you want to do about it?" I blinked, surprised by her acceptance. "You believe me?" Katie shrugged. "I believe you saw something, and I know you, Jamie. You're not the type to make up stories or chase shadows. If you're this worked up about it, there must be something to it." Relief washed over me. For the first time since that day at Spike's hut, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. "I want to go back," I said, the plan I'd been mulling over for weeks finally taking shape. "Not with Dad or the others, just us. We can do some real investigating, maybe finally figure out what's going on out there." Katie's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? After everything you've told me, you want to go back there?" "Alone?" "Not alone," I countered. "With you." "Come on, Katie. Don't tell me you're not at least a little curious." She bit her lip, clearly torn between her natural caution and the allure of solving a real mystery. "It could be dangerous," she said, but I could hear the wavering in her voice. "We'll be careful," I promised. "We'll tell our parents we're camping at Bellbird Creek. It's close enough that we can get to Spike's hut and back in a day. We'll bring supplies, stay together, and if anything feels off, we leave immediately. What do you say?" Katie stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her green eyes searching my face. Finally, she sighed. "I can't believe I'm agreeing to this, fine. But we do this smart, okay? Research, planning, the works. And if I say we leave, we leave. No arguments." I nodded eagerly, already envisioning our expedition. "Deal. Thank you, Katie. You won't regret this." As we left the classroom, making plans to meet up that weekend to start our research, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. With Katie's help, I was sure we could unravel the mystery of Spike's hut and the cowboy on the hill. But even as excitement bubbled up inside me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Was I leading my friend into danger? Was my obsession with uncovering the truth blinding me to the very real risks we might be facing? I pushed the doubts aside. We would be careful, smart, and finally I would get the answers I'd been seeking for so long. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Katie and I threw ourselves into research with a fervor that would have impressed our teachers had it been directed at our actual schoolwork. We pored over old newspapers, land records, and local history books. We created timelines, maps, and dossiers on key figures in Spike's hut's history. One name kept coming up in our research: Michael Spike Buchanan. The more we learned about him, the more unsettling the picture became. Spike had moved to the area in the late 1960s, buying the isolated property deep in the forest. From the beginning, he had been a source of fear and suspicion among the locals. Police reports from the time painted a picture of a violent, unpredictable man. There were multiple assault charges always dropped due to lack of evidence or witnesses suddenly changing their stories. And then there were the disappearances. Hikers, campers, even a few locals. All vanishing without a trace in the area around Spike's property. "Look at this," Katie said one afternoon, pushing a yellowed newspaper clipping across the table to me. The headline read, "Local man missing, foul play suspected." I scanned the article, my stomach churning. A young man named David Walsh had last been seen at the local pub, arguing with Spike Buchanan. 3 days later, his car was found abandoned on a forest road, not far from Spike's property. Despite an extensive search, no trace of David was ever found. "There's more," Katie said, her voice low. I cross-referenced the dates of all the disappearances with lunar cycles and weather patterns. "Jamie, every single one happened on or near a full moon on clear nights." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you saying?" Katie shook her head, frustration evident in her furrowed brow. "I don't know. It could be coincidence, but it feels deliberate. Like whatever was happening out there, Spike was choosing his moments carefully." As our planned expedition drew closer, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place. But with each new revelation, the shadow looming over Spike's hut grew darker and more menacing. The night before we were set to leave, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The excitement of finally taking action warred with a growing sense of dread. What if we were getting in over our heads? What if the answers we sought were better left undiscovered? As I tossed and turned, a sound from outside my window caught my attention. Soft at first, then growing louder, whispers carried on the night breeze. The same whispers I'd heard at the campsite. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out. At first I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of our backyard, silvered by moonlight. Then movement caught my eye. At the edge of the forest that bordered our property, a figure stood. Even at this distance, I recognized the slumped posture, the wide-brimmed hat. The cowboy had followed us home. As I watched, frozen in terror, the figure slowly raised its head. Though I couldn't make out its features, I felt its gaze lock onto me with an almost physical force. A voice dry as dead leaves drifted through the night. "Coming home, boy. Time to come home." I stumbled back from the window, my legs giving out beneath me. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, the figure was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever really been there at all. As dawn broke, casting pale light through my window, I made a decision. We would go ahead with our plan. Whatever was happening at Spike's hut, whatever forces were at play, I needed answers. The alternative, living with this fear, always looking over my shoulder, was unthinkable. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and sent a text to Katie. "It's time." "You ready?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Ready, let's finish this." As I began to pack my bag for our expedition, I tried to shake off the lingering dread from my nighttime encounter. But deep down, I knew we were stepping into something far more dangerous than we could have imagined. The mystery of Spike's hut was about to be unraveled, for better or for worse. The morning of our expedition dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that usually filled me with excitement for outdoor adventures. But as I shouldered my heavily laden backpack and made my way to our agreed meeting point, a sense of foreboding hung over me like a shroud. Katie was already waiting when I arrived, her own pack at her feet. The determined set of her jaw told me she was as committed to this as I was, but I could see the nervousness in her eyes. "Last chance to back out," I offered, giving her an out even as I prayed she wouldn't take it. She shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "And let you have all the fun? Not a chance, Hawthorne. We're in this together." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. Was I selfishly putting my friend in danger? But Katie's determined expression silenced my doubts. We were in this together, for better or worse. We set off, our steps quick and purposeful. The forest welcomed us with its familiar symphony of rustling leaves and birdsong. But today it felt like a facade, a cheerful mask hiding darker truths. As we hiked, I filled Katie in on my encounter the previous night. "You're sure it wasn't just a dream?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. I shook my head. It felt too real. And after everything we've learned, I don't think we can chalk any of this up to coincidence anymore. Katie nodded grimly. "Well, that's why we're here, right? To get answers." As we drew closer to Spike's hut, the forest seemed to change around us. The birdsong faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, seeming to grasp at our clothes as we passed. Finally, we emerged into the familiar clearing. Spike's hut stood before us, somehow more foreboding than I remembered. The sagging roof, the dark windows like empty eye sockets, it all seemed to radiate a palpable malevolence. "God, this place is creepy," Katie whispered, inching closer to me. I nodded, my eyes scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the cowboy figure watching us. But the clearing was empty save for us and the decaying structure before us. "Okay," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "We stick to the plan. Quick sweep of the exterior, then we go in. Any sign of trouble, we bail. Agreed?" Katie nodded, her hand moving to the pepper spray on her belt, a precaution we'd both agreed was necessary. We circled the hut slowly, noting every detail. The rotting porch creaked ominously under our weight. Rusted farm equipment lay scattered about, half swallowed by encroaching vegetation. And everywhere that feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following our every move. As we rounded the back of the hut, Katie suddenly grabbed my arm. "Jamie," she hissed. "Look." She was pointing at a patch of ground near the tree line. At first, I couldn't see what had caught her attention. Then I noticed it. A rectangular depression in the earth about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The perfect size for a grave. My blood ran cold. It could be anything, I stammered, not believing my own words. Katie shook her head. There's more, look. As my eyes adjusted, I saw what she meant. There were other depressions, less distinct but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. 5, 10, maybe more, scattered across the clearing's edge. We should go, Katie said, her voice shaking. This is too much. Part of me wanted to agree, to turn tail and run from this place and never look back. But we'd come too far to give up now. We can't, I said. Not yet. We need to know what happened here. Before Katie could protest, I strode towards the hut's entrance. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, offering no resistance as I pushed it open. Musty air rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. Jamie, wait, Katie called, but I was already stepping inside. The interior of Spike's hut was a study in chaos and decay. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the walls were covered in a patchwork of peeling wallpaper and bare, rotting wood. But it was the far wall that drew my attention. Hundreds of photographs were tacked to the wall, overlapping and jumbled. As I moved closer, my flashlight beam illuminating the display, I felt the blood drain from my face. Each photo showed a person, men, women, even a few children, and each face was crossed out with a thick red X. Oh my God, Katie breathed, coming up beside me. Are these the missing people? I finished, my voice barely a whisper. Spike's victims. As the enormity of what we were seeing sank in, a new sound cut through the silence, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkened doorway behind us. We spun around, flashlights jerking wildly. There, blocking our only exit, stood a figure that could only be described as a nightmare made flesh. It was vaguely human in shape, but twisted wrong. Matted fur covered its body and its face, dear God. Its face was a patchwork of human and animal features, as if someone had tried to stitch together a man and a wolf with no regard for nature's laws. What the fuck is that? Katie screamed, stumbling backward. The creature, for I couldn't think of it as a man, took a lumbering step forward. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see its eyes, feral and hungry, but with a spark of human intelligence that somehow made it even more terrifying. Run! I yelled, grabbing Katie's arm and pulling her towards the back of the hut. There had to be another way out, a window, anything. We scrambled over fallen furniture and piles of moldering junk, the creature's growls growing louder behind us. I spotted a window, its glass long since shattered, and shoved Katie towards it. Go, I urged, turning to face our pursuer, hoping to buy her time to escape. The creature was closer now, close enough that I could smell its fetid breath. It opened its mouth, a maw filled with razor-sharp teeth, and spoke, its voice a guttural parody of human speech. Fresh meat, it growled. Been so long. Terror clouded my mind, but one thought broke through. The cowboy, the figure I'd seen. Had this been him all along? Some monstrous transformation of Spike Buchanan, twisted by whatever dark forces held sway in this cursed place? I had no time to ponder. The creature lunged impossibly fast. I ducked, feeling claws rake the air where my head had been a moment before. Scrambling backward, I felt my hand close around something solid, a piece of broken furniture heavy in my grip. With strength born of desperation, I swung the makeshift weapon. It connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature howled in pain and rage. Not waiting to see if I'd done any real damage, I turned and dove through the window, feeling glass shards slice into my skin. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment I lay there dazed and gasping. Then Katie was there, hauling me to my feet. Come on, she screamed. It's coming! We ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Behind us I could hear the creature's enraged howls, spurred on by the scent of our blood and fear. How long we ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning as we fled through the darkening forest. Every shadow held potential danger, every snapping twig the herald of our doom. Finally, lungs burning and legs trembling, we burst out onto a familiar logging road. In the distance I could see lights, civilization, safety. We staggered towards the lights, constantly looking over our shoulders. But the creature, it seemed, had given up the chase. Or perhaps it couldn't leave the confines of its domain. Either way, as we reached the outskirts of town, I felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. What was that thing? Katie gasped, bent double and gulping air. I shook my head, wincing at the myriad cuts and bruises making themselves known now that the adrenaline was fading. I don't know, but I think we found out what happened to Spike Buchanan. And all those missing people. Katie straightened up, her face pale in the gathering dusk. We have to tell someone. The police, your dad, anyone. But even as she spoke, I knew it was hopeless. Who would believe us? A monster in the woods, a decades-old mystery of missing persons. We'd be laughed out of the police station, or worse, accused of making up stories to cover some misdeed of our own. We can't, I said, the weight of our discovery settling over me like a shroud. Who'd believe us? We don't have any proof, and if we lead people out there... I didn't need to finish the thought. We both knew what fate would await anyone who ventured unprepared into Spike's domain. So what do we do? Katie asked, her voice small and afraid. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my scattered thoughts. We keep this to ourselves for now, but we prepare. Research, plan, whatever that thing is, whatever's happening out there, it's not over, and next time, we'll be ready. As we limped back into town, concocting a story about getting lost on a hike to explain our battered state, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd set something in motion. The mystery of Spike's hut was far from solved. In fact, it had only deepened, taking on a dimension of horror I could never have imagined. But one thing was certain. Our lives would never be the same. The darkness we'd glimpsed in the heart of the forest had marked us, and I knew with grim certainty that it wouldn't let us go easily. Our ordeal was far from over. It had only just begun. The weeks following our harrowing encounter at Spike's hut passed in a blur of normalcy that felt surreal after what we'd experienced. Katie and I went through the motions of our daily lives, attending classes, doing homework, hanging out with friends. But beneath it all ran an undercurrent of tension and fear. We'd agreed to keep what we'd seen to ourselves, at least until we could make sense of it. But the weight of our secret was taking its toll. I caught Katie watching the tree line with wary eyes whenever we were outside, and I found myself jumping at shadows, always half expecting to see that monstrous figure lurking just out of sight. It was about a month after our ill-fated expedition when the first disappearance was reported. A hiker, a tourist from interstate, had gone missing in the national park not far from Spike's property. The news hit me like a physical blow, memories of those photographs on the wall of the hut flashing through my mind. It's starting again, Katie said when I called her, her voice tight with fear. Jamie, we have to do something. But what could we do? We had no proof, no way to explain what we'd seen without sounding insane. And always there was the fear. What if we led others into danger? What if our warnings only resulted in more victims for the creature that had once been Spike Buchanan? It was this dilemma that led me back to the town library, poring over old records and newspapers, searching for any clue that might help us understand what we were dealing with. Katie joined me when she could, but I could see the strain it was putting on her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she flinched at every unexpected sound. Maybe we should tell your dad, she suggested one afternoon as we huddled over a stack of microfiche. He knows something about Spike's hut. He might believe us. I shook my head, remembering the fear in Dad's eyes when he'd warned me away from the place. No, whatever he knows, he's trying to protect me from it. I can't drag him into this. Katie sighed, rubbing her temples. Then what? We can't just sit back and watch people disappear. Before I could respond, a shadow fell across our table. We looked up to see old Pete, the local I'd run into months ago when I first started researching Spike's hut. His roomy eyes narrowed as he took in the materials spread before us. Still digging? I see, he said, his voice a low rumble. Didn't I warn you to leave it alone? I exchanged a glance with Katie before turning back to the old man. Mr. Pete, I said, choosing my words carefully, we need to know. What really happened out there? What is Spike Buchanan? Old Pete was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as if looking into the past. Finally, he pulled up a chair, settling his weathered frame with a groan. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "The thing in the woods. The monster wearing Spike's skin." Katie inhaled sharply, but I just nodded, waiting for the old man to continue. Pete sighed, suddenly looking every one of his many years. "It was different back then, you know. The forest was wilder, darker. There were places a man could disappear and never be found. Spike, he knew those places better than anyone." He went on to paint a picture of Spike Buchanan as a loner, a man who shunned society for the solitude of the deep woods. But there was more to it than that. Spike had been searching for something, old Pete said, something ancient and powerful. There were stories, Pete continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, old stories from before the white men came, about a place deep in the forest where the veil between worlds was thin, where a man could make a bargain with things that ain't meant to walk in our world. I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the twisted figure we'd encountered in Spike's hut. "What kind of bargain?" I asked, dreading the answer. Pete's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and grim knowledge. "Power, immortality. But there's always a price, boy. Always." He went on to explain how Spike had vanished into the forest for weeks at a time, returning changed. How the disappearances had started soon after. Hikers, campers, even locals who ventured too far into Spike's territory. "We knew," Pete said, his voice heavy with old guilt. "Deep down we all knew what was happening. But fear makes cowards of us all. We turned a blind eye, told ourselves it was just accidents, bad luck, anything but face the truth." As Pete's tale unfolded, the pieces began to fall into place. Spike's bargain, his transformation, the years of disappearances. It all led to that nightmarish encounter in the decaying hut. "But why now?" Katie asked, breaking her silence. "Why is it starting again after all these years?" Old Pete shrugged, his expression grim. "The hunger never stops, girl. It just sleeps sometimes. But something's woken it up. And now?" He trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. As we left the library that day, our heads spinning with this new information, I felt a fierce determination take hold. We might not be able to undo the horrors of the past, but we could stop history from repeating itself. "We need a plan," I told Katie as we walked home. "A way to end this once and for all." She nodded, her face set in grim determination. "Whatever it takes. We can't let anyone else disappear." But even as we began to formulate our strategy, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads. We were just two teenagers, armed with nothing but determination and half-understood legends. What chance did we really have against a monster that had eluded justice for decades? As night fell, casting long shadows across the town, I found myself staring out my bedroom window towards the distant forest. Somewhere out there in the depths of those ancient trees, a horror beyond imagining waited, and whether we were ready or not, I knew we would have to face it. The final confrontation was coming. All we could do now was prepare, and hope that when the time came, we would be strong enough to end the nightmare that had haunted these woods for far too long. The days that followed our conversation with old Pete were a whirlwind of activity. Katie and I threw ourselves into preparation with a fervor born of desperation. We pored over every scrap of information we could find about local legends, folklore, and the occult, searching for anything that might give us an edge against the monstrous entity that Spike Buchanan had become. We also began to train in our own limited way. Katie took up running, building her stamina for what we both knew would be a grueling ordeal. I started practicing with my dad's old hunting rifle, hoping I'd never have to use it, but knowing I needed to be prepared. All the while, reports of missing hikers and campers continued to trickle in. Each new disappearance was like a knife to the gut, a reminder of our failure to act sooner. The local authorities were baffled, searching in all the wrong places, never suspecting the true horror that lurked in the heart of the forest. It was about 2 weeks into our preparations when we made a breakthrough. In an old book of local folklore, we found a ritual said to bind malevolent spirits to their place of origin. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead we had. As we gathered the necessary materials, a sense of foreboding grew. The forest seemed to darken, storms gathering on the horizon. It was as if nature itself was reacting to the approaching confrontation. On a moonless night, Katie and I ventured into the forest one last time. The trek to Spike's hut was tense, every shadow seeming to hide potential threats. When we arrived, the clearing was eerily still. We began the ritual, our voices shaking as we recited the ancient words. Suddenly, a bone-chilling howl split the air. The creature that had once been Spike Buchanan burst from the hut, its eyes blazing with inhuman rage. What followed was a nightmarish battle of wits and will. We dodged the creature's attacks, leading it into the circle we had prepared. As the final words of the ritual left our lips, a blinding light erupted from the ground. The creature howled in agony as spectral chains wrapped around it, binding it to the earth. With a final earth-shaking roar, it dissolved into mist, seeping into the ground and disappearing. In the summer of 1998, when I was just 18 years old, I found myself entangled in a forbidden romance with a girl named Evelyn. My parents vehemently opposed our relationship, their disapproval so intense that I made the impulsive decision to move out of their house and take refuge in my dilapidated old Chevy Impala. Evelyn lived in an isolated rural area, her home surrounded by dense, foreboding woods and vast, untamed fields. Each night I would park my car at the edge of an eerie, abandoned field, trek through the waist-high grass, navigate the labyrinthine forest, and secretly slip into her house. We'd spend countless hours together, lost in our own world, until the time came for me to make the unsettling journey back to my makeshift bed in the car. At first, the nightly walks through the darkened landscape didn't faze me. Evelyn's loyal and protective Rottweiler Zeus would dutifully escort me from her creaky front porch to my waiting car before turning back and disappearing into the night. His presence was a comforting constant in the oppressive darkness that enveloped the countryside. However, one fateful evening as I approached my vehicle, I realized that Zeus was nowhere to be seen. As I fumbled with my keys, a distant sound drifted through the muggy summer air. It was the unmistakable rhythm of drums, the kind you might hear in old horror films during ancient arcane rituals. The sound seemed to emanate from somewhere to the north, carried on a breeze that sent a chill down my spine. I stood there, rooted to the spot beside my car, straining to pinpoint the source of the unnerving beat. As I listened, a long-forgotten memory from my early teenage years suddenly resurfaced, flooding my mind with a sense of unease. Back then, there had been whispered rumors circulating at school about a secretive, enigmatic group that resided on a remote, dead-end road, located about a mile north of Evelyn's house. Tales of strange nocturnal gatherings and bone-chilling screams piercing the night had spread like wildfire among the student body. At the time, I had dismissively chalked it up to nothing more than idle gossip, the product of overactive imaginations in a small, isolated town. But now, as the drumming echoed through the darkness, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that there may have been more truth to those stories than I had ever wanted to believe. With a growing sense of trepidation, I clambered into my car, the rusted door creaking in protest as I slammed it shut behind me. I tried to settle into the cramped, musty confines of the vehicle, but sleep proved elusive as my mind raced with the unsettling implications of what I had just heard. I couldn't shake the image of cloaked figures gathering in the woods, their faces obscured by shadows as they danced around a roaring bonfire, their movements in perfect sync with the relentless pounding of the drums. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around my shoulders, as if it could somehow shield me from the malevolent forces that seemed to lurk just beyond the tree line. As I finally drifted off into a fitful, troubled sleep, I had no way of knowing that the drumming in the night was only the beginning of a waking nightmare that would soon consume every aspect of my life. The malevolent entity that lurked in the woods had taken notice of my presence, and it had no intention of letting me escape its grasp. In the days and weeks that followed, the nightly walks through the woods became an increasingly terrifying ordeal. The once comforting darkness now felt like a suffocating cloak of malice, every shadow and rustle of leaves a potential harbinger of unspeakable horrors. The slightest snap of a twig or whisper of the wind would send my heart racing, my palms slick with sweat as I fought to control my rising panic. And then there were the drums. Night after night, the relentless pounding would begin as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the rhythmic beating echoing through the trees like the footsteps of some great, lumbering beast. It felt as if the very forest itself was alive, pulsing with a dark ancient energy that sought to draw me in, to consume me whole. But the true terror of my situation didn't fully sink in until one particularly moonless night, as I made my way back to my car after a long, unsettling evening at Evelyn's. The inky blackness seemed to press in on me from all sides. The only sound the crunching of dead leaves beneath my feet and the distant mocking call of some nocturnal bird. As I approached the edge of the field where my Impala was parked, I suddenly caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head, my eyes straining to pierce the gloom. There, standing motionless in the center of the field, was the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure. It was as if they had materialized out of the darkness itself, their form an eerie absence of light against the slightly less oppressive blackness of the night sky. For a moment I was frozen in place, my mind reeling with the horrific possibilities of what this apparition could be. Was it one of the rumored cultists cloaked in dark robes and performing some unspeakable ritual under the cover of darkness? Or was it something far more sinister? An entity not of this world that had been drawn to the malevolent energy that seemed to permeate every inch of this cursed land. With a surge of pure, unadulterated terror, I fumbled for my car keys, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely fit them into the lock. As I wrenched open the door and practically dove inside, I risked one final glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure bearing down on me, its face a twisted mask of pure evil. But the field was empty. The silhouette vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I sat there for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribcage as I tried to process what I had just seen. Had it been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a passing cloud? Or had I truly witnessed something paranormal? A manifestation of the dark forces that seemed to hold sway over this isolated corner of the world. The uncertainty was almost worse than the fear itself, the not knowing gnawing at the edges of my sanity like a ravenous beast. With a shaking hand, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life like a wounded animal. I knew that I needed to get as far away from this place as possible, to put as much distance between myself and the malevolent entity that seemed to have marked me as its next victim. But even as I peeled out of the field, tires spinning on the damp grass, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. The darkness had taken root in my soul, and there was no escape from the nightmare that my life had become. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of my terror began to take its toll. Dark circles etched themselves beneath my eyes, a testament to the countless sleepless nights spent huddled in my car, jumping at every errant sound and flicker of shadow. I grew gaunt and pale, my once healthy appetite replaced by a constant gnawing sense of dread that settled in the pit of my stomach like a lead weight. Evelyn, too, began to notice the change in me. Her once warm, inviting smile now held a tinge of concern, her eyes searching mine for some hint of the carefree, light-hearted boy she had fallen in love with. But that boy was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man, haunted by the knowledge of the malevolent forces that lurked just beyond the veil of normalcy. I knew that I couldn't continue on like this, living in constant fear of the unknown horrors that stalked me from the shadows. But I also knew that I couldn't bring myself to tell Evelyn the truth, to burden her with the knowledge of the darkness that had taken hold of me. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of grim determination, I made the decision to end things between us, to flee this cursed place and never look back. The night I left was one of the hardest of my life. Evelyn wept as I packed my meager belongings into the trunk of my Impala, her tears glistening in the pale moonlight that filtered through the trees. She begged me to stay, to talk to her, to let her help me through whatever was troubling me, but I knew that there was no help for what ailed me, no solace to be found in the arms of another. The darkness had marked me as its own, and I was powerless to resist its siren call. As I drove away from Evelyn's house that night, the drums began to beat once more, their rhythm a mocking tribute to my cowardice and defeat. I could feel the weight of the entity's gaze upon me, its malevolent presence a palpable force that seemed to fill the car, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my eyes fixed on the road ahead as I tried to outrun the terror that nipped at my heels. But even as I put mile after mile between myself and that accursed place, I knew that I could never truly escape the horror that had taken root in my soul. The entity that lurked in the woods of Evelyn's property had claimed me as its own, and it would follow me wherever I went, a constant, lurking presence at the edge of my consciousness. And so I drove on into the night, my mind a whirlwind of fear and despair as I tried to come to terms with the grim reality of my situation. Little did I know that my nightmare was only just beginning, and that the true depths of the darkness that had claimed me were yet to be revealed. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months as I tried to put the events of that fateful summer behind me. I drifted from town to town, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over my shoulder for some sign of the malevolent presence that haunted my every waking moment. I took odd jobs where I could find them, living out of my car and subsisting on a diet of cheap fast food and convenience store snacks. But no matter how far I ran, the entity that had claimed me as its own was never far behind. I would catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure lurking at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. And the drums. The drums followed me wherever I went, their relentless beating a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken hold of my soul. It was during one of my longer stays in a small, forgettable town near the coast that I first heard about the Church of the Forsaken. Whispered rumors spoke of a secretive cult that had taken root in the area. Their beliefs centered around the worship of an ancient, nameless entity that was said to grant immense power to those who pledged their souls to its service. At first, I dismissed the rumors as nothing more than idle gossip, the product of bored small-town minds with nothing better to do. But as the weeks wore on, and the weight of my own personal hell began to take its toll, I found myself drawn to the idea of the cult, a moth to a flame. Perhaps I thought, in the embrace of others who had known the touch of the darkness, I could find some measure of solace, some way to make sense of the nightmare my life had become. And so, one moonless night, I found myself standing at the edge of a dense, forbidding forest. The location of the church's hidden compound, scrawled on a scrap of paper clutched tightly in my hand. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, and the only sound was the distant, mocking call of some unseen bird. As I stepped into the tree line, the darkness seemed to close in around me, a physical presence that pressed against my skin like a living thing. The branches clawed at my face and arms, leaving thin, stinging scratches that wept beads of blood. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to find some answer to the questions that haunted me, some way to make sense of the horror that had claimed me as its own. And then, as I emerged into a small moonlit clearing, I saw it. Rising from the center of the clearing was a massive, twisted tree, its branches gnarled and reaching towards the sky like the fingers of some great ancient beast. And there, at the base of the tree, was a group of figures cloaked in black, their faces obscured by deep hoods. As I approached, one of the figures stepped forward, his movements fluid and graceful, almost inhuman. He reached up and lowered his hood, revealing a face that was pale and gaunt, with eyes that glittered with a fevered intensity. "Welcome, my child," he said, his voice a sibilant whisper that seemed to curl around the edges of my mind like a serpent. "We have been waiting for you." And with those words, I knew that I had finally found what I had been searching for, a place where the darkness that had claimed me as its own could be embraced, even celebrated. Little did I know that in the heart of that twisted ancient forest, I would finally come face to face with the true nature of the entity that had haunted me for so long, and that the price of that knowledge would be higher than I could ever have imagined. As I stepped into the circle of cloaked figures, a sense of unease began to creep over me, a prickling at the back of my neck that sent shivers down my spine. The air around us seemed to hum with a strange electric energy, a palpable force that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl. The figure who had spoken to me, who I would come to know as the high priest of the Church of the Forsaken, motioned for me to kneel before the twisted ancient tree that dominated the clearing. As I sank to my knees, the damp earth soaking through the fabric of my jeans, he began to speak, his voice a hypnotic whisper that seemed to fill my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. He spoke of the entity that they worshipped, a being of immense power and unknowable motives that had existed since the dawn of time. He spoke of the gifts that the entity bestowed upon its faithful, the ability to tap into the raw primal forces of the universe and bend them to their will. and he spoke of the price that must be paid for such power, the sacrifice of one's very soul to the entity's eternal service. As I listened, I could feel the darkness that had haunted me for so long stirring within me, a cold, seductive whisper that promised an end to my suffering, a release from the terror that had consumed my every waking moment. And in that moment, kneeling before that twisted, ancient tree, I knew that I would do anything, give anything, to be free of the burden that had been placed upon me. And so, with a voice that trembled with a mixture of fear and longing, I pledged myself to the entity, my words a solemn vow that echoed through the stillness of the forest. As I spoke, I could feel a strange, icy sensation spreading through my veins, a numbness that seemed to emanate from the very core of my being. And then, as the final words of my pledge left my lips, the world around me exploded into a kaleidoscope of color and sound, a swirling vortex of energy that ripped through my body like a hurricane. I could feel the entity's presence filling me, a vast, ancient intelligence that dwarfed my own meager existence. And in that moment, I knew that I had made a terrible mistake, that the price of the power I had sought would be higher than I could ever have imagined. As the vortex of energy subsided, I found myself lying on the forest floor, my body trembling and slick with sweat. The cloaked figures had vanished, leaving me alone in the clearing with nothing but the twisted, ancient tree and the echoes of my own foolishness. And as I staggered to my feet, my mind reeling from the enormity of what I had done, I knew that my nightmare was far from over. The entity that I had pledged myself to would never let me go, its icy grip on my soul a constant, inescapable reminder of the terrible choice I had made. And somewhere in the depths of my being, I could hear the drums beginning to beat once more, a mocking tribute to my own hubris and despair. In the days and weeks that followed my initiation into the Church of the Forsaken, I found myself consumed by a strange, feverish energy, a sense of purpose that I had never known before. The entity's presence was a constant, throbbing pulse at the back of my mind, a whispering voice that guided my every action and thought. Under the tutelage of the high priest and the other members of the cult, I began to learn the secrets of the dark arts, the forbidden knowledge that had been passed down through generations of the entity's faithful. I learned how to harness the power of the entity, to channel its dark energy into spells and rituals that defied the very laws of nature. And with each passing day, I could feel myself growing stronger, more attuned to the twisted ancient forces that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. But even as I reveled in my newfound power, I could not shake the sense of unease that had taken root in the depths of my being. The entity's presence was a constant, oppressive weight upon my soul, a reminder of the terrible price I had paid for the gifts I now possessed. And the more I learned of the entity's true nature, the more I began to fear the fate that awaited me. For the entity was not a benevolent god as the high priest had claimed, but a malevolent force of pure, unbridled chaos, a being that fed upon the suffering and despair of its followers. And I knew that, in pledging myself to its service, I had consigned my soul to an eternity of torment and madness. And so, even as I threw myself into the dark rituals and ceremonies of the church, I began to search for a way out, a means of breaking free from the entity's iron grip. I pored over ancient tomes and forbidden texts, seeking some glimmer of hope, some hint of a way to reclaim my soul from the darkness that had consumed it. But with each passing day, I could feel the entity's hold on me growing stronger, its whispers more insistent, more demanding. And I knew that time was running out, that soon I would be lost forever, just another puppet dancing to the tune of an ancient, malevolent god. It was during one of the church's darkest rituals, a ceremony that required the sacrifice of an innocent soul, that I finally found the strength to break free. As I stood over the bound and gagged victim, my ceremonial dagger poised to strike, I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of revulsion, a sickness in the pit of my stomach that brought me to my knees. And in that moment, as the entity's whispers reached a fever pitch, urging me to complete the sacrifice and seal my fate forever, I made my choice. With a scream of defiance, I turned the blade upon myself, plunging it deep into my own flesh. The pain was unbearable, a searing agony that ripped through my body like a bolt of lightning. But even as I fell to the ground, my blood pooling around me in a spreading crimson stain, I could feel the entity's grip on my soul loosening, its whispers fading into a distant, mocking echo. And as I lay there, My life ebbing away with each ragged breath, I knew that I had won my freedom, that I had broken the chains that had bound me to the entity's service. But even as the darkness closed in around me, I could not shake the feeling that my nightmare was far from over, that the entity's hold on my soul was not so easily broken.